Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Questions About Music. Questions About Music is the colloquium series of the music department here at the University of Alberta. And like many series like this, we have invited guests. I'll introduce my guests in a moment. But something that we do different from other series, also series that we run with a different format, that instead of asking people to come and give a formal paper presentation, we have a conversation with them, just kind of like to go in the behind the scene sometimes of the kind of work that people do. And it's a series for performers, composers, people interested in media studies, popular music, musicology, ethnomusicology, music theory, across music studies, for people in the Edmonton music community, more broadly, people in other departments. So if you have ideas of people that you like us to converse with, topic that you like us to discuss, don't hesitate to get in touch. My name is Fabio Morabito. I'm a musicologist here at the University of Alberta. And today I'm joined, it's a very special occasion for us today. It's a very special homecoming edition of Questions About Music, because I have here with me David Gramit, who is Professor Emeritus of Musicology at the University of Alberta. And David has been working and teaching and researching at the University of Alberta from 1991, I think, till 2018. So he brings back to us a ton of institutional history and memories that we want to know all about. We want to know about how it was to be someone in music studies, a music studies scholar when you started. We want to know how the U of A looked like and how it functioned when you joined and during your tenure here. And yeah, perhaps we can start with that, David. So like, first of all, so glad that you're here. And welcome back.
Thank you.
And can you introduce yourself a bit to this audience? Some of the people in the audience are very familiar faces to you, but there are some younger people in the audience that might have not met you. So do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Who is David Gramit?
Oh dear. And some of you will know if I lie, so it's a little frightening. Yes, as Fabio said, I taught here from 1991 to 2018, and this was the place where the vast majority of my musicological career happened. Although I have to admit that when I saw an ad for a job at the University of Alberta, I wasn't quite sure of the order of the provinces west of Ontario, so I had to sort of look that up before I... but I found out and was fortunate enough to be hired here. Having ended up in musicology, inspired by good teaching, I think, of an undergraduate teacher at a liberal arts college that I was at in Minnesota, who was just really good at his job. And I had played instruments and started in band and ended up on bassoon because I wanted to play in an orchestra. And discovered that, gee, there was this world of studying music, which meant I could deal with music without having to go into a practice room very often, which was really, really, I've always liked libraries better than practice rooms. And maybe one of the saddest things about the way scholarship has developed is that people don't have to go into libraries as much as we used to. But anyway, aside from that nostalgia, I ended up going to graduate school in music and musicology, which was a rather different discipline than it is now. And we can get to some of that stuff later, sure. Maybe. But yes, got here in 1991 after having taught a year at McGill. And in the same year, Henry Klumpenhauer was hired in music theory, and Regula Qureshi was already here in ethnomusicology. She had been a kind of fixture in Edmonton music since the late 1960s, I think, but was here and introducing the kind of music scholarship that she was a master of. And it was a lovely place to come in that respect, with a kind of vital intellectual life ready to go, along with a number of congenial colleagues in other fields who were either there already or came shortly thereafter. So it was and still seems to be, which is one of the lovely things to discover on coming back, a vital place where a lot of interesting stuff is going on. So it's a delight to be back here in a room that hasn't changed all that much.
We're working on that.
Okay,
Maybe there will be some refurbishing of this room soon. But it's lovely to hear about this kind of like intellectual environment in which you came in and you contributed to. And I was wondering if you can tell a little bit more about your research or your early passions. Kind of like, in many ways, I gave a very truncated introduction of you because I wanted you to tell us about, maybe how you fell in love with Schubert, or what got you to be the Schubert scholar that people know you for, and not just Schubert in many ways, but very 19th century European kind of like questions of audience reception, but also what does it mean to sell serious music. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, okay. When I went into musicology, I actually imagined going into early music research, partly because I had some background in playing early music, recorder mostly, and also at that time that was one of the respectable one of the respectable musicology avenues. So I started graduate school in 1981. The journal 19th Century Music, which is kind of a locus for scholarship on music in the 19th century, had only started in 1977. It's hard to imagine, but studying the music of the 1800s as a musicologist was in the late 1970s a slightly rebellious stance, which sounds a little bizarre. But while I was in grad school, Joseph Kerman, the Berkeley musicologist, came and gave a talk early on in the early 80s and talked about, among other things, good things about Charles Rosen's book, The Classical Style. And the next day, I went into my musicology introductory seminar, wherein the professor, who will remain nameless but was quite well known, held up Charles Rosen's Classical Style and said, "I just want to make sure you all understand that this is not the kind of scholarship you should be emulating. This formal aesthetic analysis just has no place in musicology." Honest to God.
Wow.
So Joseph Kerman was avant-garde in advocating A, studying 19th century music, and B, talking about what was interesting about the music, which sounds really bizarre if you state it that baldly, but the discipline had tootled merrily along, in North America at least, in much less I don't want to, critical is the wrong word, but less musically engaged ways. And so that was a start. And then, sadly, I forgot the prop that I brought along. I brought along a prop for this talk, and I left it in Fabio's car. Oh well.
It's mine now.
Yeah.
It's a book.
Yes. When I was finishing up my dissertation, I was working in libraries, which is another great thing about libraries. Students could be hired in them to shelve books. And I distinctly remember coming across on a cart of books being processed a book edited by Richard Leppert and Susan McClary called Music and Society and the Politics of something, something, and something. There's a subtitle. But it was one of the first published volumes of what at that time, within a couple of years, became known as the new musicology, which has followed all other such new things and now being a very old thing. But when I just paged through it, because that's an intriguing sort of title for somebody finishing a musicology dissertation on Schubert, suddenly there was these voices talking about music as a part of society and the sounds of music being in some way related to what's going on in society. And that was eye-opening, not totally surprising, because anybody who listens to music has some inkling of that, but to be talking about it was a very new thing.
And maybe something that your own training was not that present, or maybe your musicological training was not about that?
Not primarily. I mean, I did have some, because there were 19th century music people in my department, there was talk about what's going on in the music, but not the social context of it. I had stumbled across some ethnomusicology as an undergraduate, Alan Lomax's Cantometrics. Julia is there somewhere, she will know that one, yes. Which was kind of weird and interesting. But it wasn't so much talked about in musicology. So I did a Schubert and context dissertation, but context meant literature, literature and ideas, which are, that's certainly interesting enough. You can talk about that for a long time, especially when you're talking about Schubert and songs. I was telling Fabio that I don't really have a story of my passion for Schubert driving me into musicology, because to be very honest, I wanted a dissertation topic that would get me to Europe, because I hadn't been there. Something I had done in a seminar made Schubert seem interesting, and so I wrote up a dissertation proposal on Schubert, and it worked. So I got to Vienna, and that was cool. But in the meantime, Schubert became very interesting, and as well as someone with whom you could look at German poetry as well as music in interesting ways. And that kind of got me to the U of A, because Regula Qureshi also had a big interest in Lieder, although it wasn't a part of her scholarship, it was a part of her life. She grew up with this stuff. She probably knew more Schubert songs than I do now, just having grown up doing them.
Wow. It's for me, it's very interesting, because I've inherited David's office, and there are bits and pieces of people that have lived in this office before. There's the entire collection of 19th century music, the journal that David just mentioned, and then there are bits and pieces of Regula's collection of Lieder still in my office. And so I get sort of like, almost like today for me is meeting these people that have owned this object before, and for which this object had particular meaning, especially at that point in time. Yeah. So you joined in the U of A with Regula, kind of like singing Lieder on I don't want to say on a daily basis, but probably quite regularly. And you studying that, at that point you have already been in Vienna, and you already encountered the work of Susan McClary and Richard Leppert. So probably once you came to the U of A, your work on Schubert was already more towards the context and the political.
It was heading in that direction. I had the good fortune of I had the good fortune to live while the National Endowment for the Humanities still had some money, and did summer seminars for for recent faculty members, people with recent doctorates, and Richard Leppert did one at the University of Minnesota, which was a wonderful way to be introduced to him and his work, and a number of people who are still great colleagues from that seminar, and started looking at things like the reception of Schubert and what had been made of him in Victorian England, for instance, and other questions of what people not just what do Schubert's songs mean in the abstract, but what have they meant to particular people at particular times, which reframes the question in interesting and, I think, productive ways that start to suggest that there's no, and this is not a surprise to anyone who's read literary criticism, there's not a meaning of the song that Schubert wrote and there it is, right? And what have people made of it and why becomes an interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, that article that you just mentioned, Constructing Victorian Schubert, 1993, published in 19th Century Music, this journal, that such a watershed, kind of like, the foundation in 1977. You publishing one of your first major piece in 19th Century Music in 1993. I mean, for me, that still such an important article in the way you're looking at Victorian sensitivities, so late 19th century England, and how so Schubert was so kind of like taboo or not quite fitting. Do you want to tell these audiences that perhaps they haven't read your article?
They haven't.
They haven't. They should. It's a wonderful article.
It's on the list.
Yeah.
It's on the reader list. But I mean, for me, that it's such an important piece of understanding how Schubert was feminized, for example, and was seen as a lesser composer, precisely because through the lens of Victorian people, it seemed the less appropriate.
It's right. It's this opposition of Beethoven and Schubert.
Yeah,
right?
male and female.
Yes, male and female, like Haydn and Boccherini.
Yeah.
Is a similar thing had happened there, and the Victorians took it and ran with it. It becomes naturalized in a way in Victorian discourse around Schubert and lives on into the 20th century, at least as pretty strongly, at least up to World War II, and echoes of it even beyond there. So that yes, Schubert is a great composer, but yes, you almost don't have to complete the sentence. Great, but he didn't have the intellectual reflectiveness of Beethoven. He didn't have the ability to do great big things. But these songs are nice.
Yeah, but you're saying, so you said World War II, but some of these stereotypes still linger in terms of the simplicity.
Yes,
I remember a very memorable passage of your article where you say that people were looking at that time, Beethoven sketches were very well known and prominent. There was a lot of musicological work to decode the handwriting of Beethoven, and then no one found Schubert sketches. So they were thinking like, oh, this is more sort of like simple composing.
Yes,
there wasn't much effort behind it.
He writes from the heart.
He writes from the heart.
And the heart is feminine, right? The brain is masculine. So, And,
a clear othering of Schubert.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And yet, he's fully ensconced in the canon. There's no questioning, although there was in the 19th century some that, there was one critic whose name I will not remember at this point, but who said something like a full evening of exposure to Schubert leaves one kind of with a sickly feeling, and he said, "I speak from experience." That if you listen to too much of this stuff, it'll kind of, I guess, undermine your masculinity.
And maybe it's incredible because of course this is the voices of Victorians or like late 19th century England, but you were doing this research in the 1990s.
Yes.
So what was this kind of like the sort of readership for your work? Like were people used to this kind of to being brought to this be brought to their attention? This kind of like demasculination of listening to Schubert, or like what was the reaction? How was to publish this in 1993?
I wouldn't call it pioneering at that point, because that's really, Susan McClary had broken some ground. Suzanne Cusick had been publishing some lovely things by then. But it was a time of ferment for sure, and it was a really interesting time to be a musicologist because all that stuff was going on. Leppert, McClary, Carl Dahlhaus was a new voice in English language
newly
musicology.
Translated.
Yeah, newly translated, exactly.
1989.
And people didn't know what to do with him either. I mean, he turns out to be a fairly conservative voice, but he's a socially informed conservative voice, which was a new thing.
Yeah.
And plus he had read Adorno, which nobody had done
exactly.
at that
For
point.
those who haven't encountered this name before, German musicologist, very influential book on 19th century European music that was translated in 1989. Again, conservative, but considering the social aspect of music, for which at that point, for this wave of interest in the sociality of music, people started reading quite extensively.
Yeah, and to bring it back to the U of A, at that point, it made it the existence of that kind of scholarship in musicology made it possible to have more informed conversations with ethnomusicologists, and the presence of an open-minded theorist made it possible to have conversations across those fields that hadn't happened a lot before. And that was one of the motivations for developing the MA and PhD in musicology,
in music.
Exactly. That was one of the insistences of that we have an MA in music, which would not just allow, but actually require initially people to take coursework in all three of those areas.
We still do.
Yeah, excellent.
It's still the case.
Yes.
And so I am actually so happy to have David here because we still teach this program. It's called MA in Music, or the PhD is also in music. And but we collaborate as a music studies department very, very much in a conversation between people that do musicology, popular music and media studies, ethnomusicologists, and people that take this degree at the U of A, they have to take at least 3 out of 4 per seminar in this discipline, regardless which discipline, subdiscipline they feel they belong. And this is one of the things that we are the most proud, and this is one of the men that created it. So can you tell us a little bit more how that came about? What was the idea behind this kind of, because I don't know many programs that have that. I think I find that it's quite a unique thing. Also when I go to the American Musicological Society annual meeting and I do recruitment fair, I tell people about this and they say like, you guys do this together? It's like, yes. Yeah,
and it is still, I'm frankly surprised that it is still as unusual as it is. But in a good, I'm still persuaded that it's in a good way, that it is that. And it was about, to a large extent, about conversation. And one of the things that sadly has gone by the wayside, although actually this series recreates it in a somewhat different format. We originally had, it was Music 610 and 611, which were, I'm not going to remember the title of it, but essentially we gathered several faculty members together and read cool stuff and talked about it. And it died mostly because in a university situation, how do you deal with those fragmentary teaching credits for people's teaching loads, and people start resenting the fact that one person who coordinates it gets some teaching credit, but the other one is just
guest lecturing or
something
like that.
Yes. And that's what, how institutional reality and intellectual aspirations sometimes collide. Yes. But that was lovely, and that out of that conversation, in fact, grew the Marx book. That we did a little reading in Marx, and stuff came out of that. But those were wonderful conversations. I think the faculty members may have found them more wonderful than the students sometimes, because we got kind of carried away and the others were sort of sitting there listening sometimes. But that was exciting, and it kept the ferment alive. And this, I think, has potential to do the same thing, which is lovely.
Thank you for saying that. But I mean, you mentioned the Marx book, which, I still go to conferences today and I say like, I work at the University of Alberta, and it's like, you're a bunch of people that did the Marxist book in 2002. And I was like, I wasn't there. But again, this guy and the other people that were really part of this. I love the way you say kind of like a very vibrant conversation going on. And I think that's the best kind of department in which best kind of sort of like place you can find yourself in to have stimulating intellectual conversation. If you find yourself having stimulating intellectual conversation, don't take that for granted. Doesn't happen all the time, everywhere. But so keep your peeps, around to do that.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
Cultivate it, because that's another important things. Also as graduate student, that's really important to do. So do invest in having this conversation is really important. So you created this graduate program before. What was before you created this program?
There was a master's in music history and one in music theory.
So separate ones.
Separate ones, yes. And I believe there was already one in ethno. Oh, maybe not. I'm not actually. No, because. Well, no, as a doctorate. Some people had to kind of sneak to work with Regula on a doctorate in ethno. You had to sneak around by doing it in anthropology, which was helped by having Michael Ash, the son of Moses Ash, in the anthropology department. And now I've forgotten what the question I was answering was.
No, I think it was like, there wasn't a question there, but we're talking about your time at the U of A, and I think the question was about what was there before you created this program.
Yes, the master's degrees, which were definitely, they were traditional programs in those disciplines, which were quite respectable, but we just wanted something different and that would take advantage of what we have, not be hampered by what we didn't have. And what we didn't have was a big body of 8 musicologists.
7 theories.
Yes. We didn't have an early Renaissance person, a late Renaissance person, a Baroque up to but not including J.S. Bach. And we didn't have all those specialists, right? We had people in each of these big areas who happily were interested in talking to each other. So we kind of thematized that, and
I think the schools that have those are often isolationist, where each of those little areas is its own.
Yes, and tend not to talk to each other.
Not to talk to each other. In a way, kind of like this was ahead of time, because now those schools are being cut, so very few schools can have those level of specialization. In a way, because of this, we were ahead of time
Thank you, Ralph Klein, for what you did for us.
Fascinating. And so I want to ask you kind of like, because in a way your work was very much 19th century, grounded in the 19th century European aspect. And one of before asking you more about how you transitioned to think more about early Edmonton music scene, which kind of like your later work is about it. I want to ask you a little bit more. How was talking about, I was rereading some of your work recently before this talk, and I found you dealing a lot with the autonomous work of art. And this is something that interests me and interests Patrick. I know it's kind of like the idea of the musical museum and the non-musical museum. So it's interesting to find aspects of the work that we're doing now at the U of A resonating with your work so prominently. And I wanted to ask you, how was to work around the autonomous work of art and leader song that is not necessarily a medium that was for a long time recognized to be autonomous. Because of the word, because of also the sort of like.
How many hours do we have? Golly. There is this tradition of talking about leader as little jewels, little things that are lovely and perfect and self-contained, which is not so different from talking about a self-contained symphony. But also, the lead had a couple of advantages in if you want to talk about something other than the perfect little self-contained object. one of which is that there's this poetic text, inevitably, that you need to talk about, even if you want to talk about it in a way that says the composer really ignores this and does something totally musical that conflicts with it. That's fine, but you're still having to deal with something outside the notes themselves. The other is the lead was late to the concert hall. It was domestic music, which has associations that are different than something that you sit in silence in a concert hall and listen to. I mean, even the sitting in silence in a concert hall is a later 19th century throwback, that is constructed backwards onto a very different...
It's an historical formation in itself.
Exactly, yes. But the lead as sociable music invites other ways to think about it, I think, maybe a little more easily than some other genres do. Similarly with opera, I suspect. Yeah.
I wonder, do you think that it played a part, in making the leader a musicological object, a respectable musicological object? Do you think that making it an autonomous work of art was part of...
Oh, absolutely. Yes. That in order for it to shed the unseemly associations of the drawing room, you had to make it into something else, make it into, it's a work of art, albeit small, it is still a work of art.
Yeah.
Vermeer's paintings are little, they don't have to be huge, you don't have to be a huge Rembrandt, right?
No, but I love how you, in your work, you're very attentive of not creating a kind of like a monument about you don't make monuments about this leader, and this is very evident, for example, in you, focusing on just one and doing a very deep dive into it, but without kind of like saying the leader is this majestic like. I think you're very attentive at doing that.
I love, I confess, I am someone who was once accused by a prominent musicologist of wanting to do a musicology without the notes, which I wear as a badge of honor still. But nonetheless, I love those deep dives into a song. I haven't published many of them because, well, analysis isn't the thing that comes most easily and naturally to me. I love to do it, but it's just I got other stuff that I'm kind of drawn to too.
You say so, but your analyses are so beautiful. Okay, go ahead.
But I love to do that, but also to pull back and say, but wait a minute, who was listening to this, and in what context did it show up? Most of Schubert's songs that were published during his lifetime were published in sets, which actually Walter Dürr, one of the editors of the new Schubert edition, was one of the first people to start drawing attention to, wait a minute, these collections of songs that appeared together seem to have some interesting ways of talking to each other within the set. And if you do that connected with asking what might someone have made out of a song, for instance, in which in the text several rustics of various sorts, a fisherman, a hunter, comes trotting by and can't find and can't tell the speaker where his beloved is, and then suddenly there's this magical transcendence. You get social issues brought in with a song that is beautifully self-contained, but yet points outward to social issues and is published with texts, one of which is by one of Schubert's friends who was exiled for political activity. And so you get this sort of magical transcendence as well as the homage to, yes.
Is this one of the, because I'm fascinated by, you following these, one could call it rabbit holes of kind of like following how the text or the music points to social aspects. Is this one of the way in which you you found yourself engaging with the audience for this music.
Yeah, and I think
could one say that is the primary way in which you studied the audience for the leader?
I think that's how I got into asking about audiences, and then asking about audiences. I dropped the leader and just started looking at the audiences.
Yes, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that started asking about how some of these ideas about what the work of art is, where they came from, and what might have motivated them among people who were active in music or writing about music. And because I happened to be working in the late 18th, early 19th century in German-speaking lands, that's where I ended up doing it. And it so happens that there's a fair amount of music from the late 18th and early 19th century German-speaking lands that people pay attention to in the classical music world. How did... I mean, I wasn't asking how Beethoven, why is it that Beethoven became famous? Because, one of the most obvious reasons is he wrote pretty good music. It's not that so much as, granted that, what was accomplished by the discourse that developed around that really interesting music. Both in general and in some very particular instances where I stumbled across this book of letters of a guy who was going to university in the very early part of the 1800s and was a violinist playing string quartets and things, and encountering Beethoven, but also encountering touring jaw harp players and blind flute virtuosos, and writing about reactions. And on the one hand, Beethoven is transcendent, but also I'm pretty interested in this jaw harp player too. So, how do you juggle that kind of thing? And those kind of questions about musical life started interesting me more, and so I drifted into sort of more social history of musical life.
Is this how you would describe your book, Cultivating Music?
Exactly, yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more for those who have yet to read it?
Yeah. It's still available. I haven't made enough to get any royalties from it for a very long time, so if you all want to run out and order it, Cultivating Music is, it's one of the things musicologists seem to love to do is make titles that can be understood two ways. So it's, one is what we cultivate music, and music cultivates us, and cultivating music kind of tried to capture both of those. But it was how the growth of this assertion that music is aesthetically, morally, and socially good for you, developed in German-speaking Europe at a time when aristocratic patronage of music was on the decline. Part of the, in some ways it's a series of case studies, but there's kind of a thread through there of how people who were interested in music could explain what they were doing and make a claim that what they were doing was valuable, whether it's valuable for nation building or valuable for educating people or valuable for social organization. All of these discourses came around to help explain what music accomplished. And it got me able, the deep dive there was into all these obscure documents about people talking about music, and collecting enough of those and trying to come up, what story could make sense of all of these in some way? And I think in some ways that's what we do as musicologists. We collect a bunch of stuff that seems somehow to us related, and then we try and come up with a story that makes sense of it. And I think if we remember that, it helps us not to assume that we're discovering the truth that is the natural
order of things.
Yeah, because we're making up stories. We want to make up good stories that don't conflict overtly with anything we found, but we're still finding all this interesting stuff and trying to make sense of it in some way by connecting it. Right?
Yeah, but I mean, this storytelling, I think, it becomes particularly, I know that you say like it's not the truth or it is not, it's me telling the story in a specific way. I am definitely aware of that, but I'm also very aware of how some of these ways of valuing music in Europe, in Germany at that time have been, for reasons of empire, also exported and became particularly also important of the way class was asserted, or both in Europe and in the colonial world, and hierarchies, social hierarchies were created and asserted. And so it's a very kind of like, for me, you know, as a graduate student reading your book, you know, for me was like almost doing an archaeology of my own musical surroundings. Kind of like, for me, it was such a discovery to not necessarily kind of like, oh, this is what happened, but more like people in the 19th century were valuing music in Europe in this way, and there are still ways in which we do quite similar processes of valuing.
It's a both and. I think I don't want to suggest that. When I say I'm making up a story, I don't mean it seems true to me, but there are other ways of reading these things. And also, I think it's important, or it was important to me, that there is an element of I'm telling my own story because I still feel this way. You know, a couple of nights ago, in order to calm the cat who likes to sit on my lap in the night, you turn on TV and watch something, and there's this series on Mozart's life that was on the Knowledge Network in DC, which is pure hagiography. You know, Mozart is great, and you know, various performers and musicologists testified to that, and they had dramatizations, and Mozart is also weird, which they also acknowledged, but as a person, and the musicologist in me said, this is pure hagiography, this is Saint Mozart come to life, and the person who listens to Mozart said, yeah, this is Mozart, and I still cannot begin to comprehend how someone could do that, all that, and die at 35. You know, so there's a construction, and yet I'm a product of that construction, and I hear this stuff, and it's just that experience that I don't want to give up. So you know, I'm talking about myself too.
Perfect. Yes. And speaking of talking about yourself, you know, you being in Edmonton, doing this work in Europe, at some point you start working also on early music in the settler Edmonton scene. How did that play out?
Yeah, well, I have to mention, thanks to Patrick for giving me the chance to talk to his wonderful Music in Canada students this afternoon, and I mentioned this there, that there was a comment of Regula's that stuck in my head for a long time, and Regula Qureshi grew up in Basel from a very distinguished Basel family with a classical education and classical music training, and came to Edmonton in the 1960s. And I only came to Edmonton in 1991, and I saw it. I can only imagine what Edmonton must have seemed like to someone who grew up in Europe and was trained at Curtis in Philadelphia and came to Edmonton in 1960-something, early 60s, I think. And I remember her saying, everything is so new here. It's you know, it is such a new place. And that kind of stuck in my head until my son had to do a project on Canadian history in grade 5, 6, or 7 at Victoria School for the Arts. Whether through parental influence or not, he chose to do something on the history of music in Edmonton, which I was able to help him on, and he got to learn how to use a microfilm reader, which was pretty cool, and things like that. So looking through old papers, and did a little thing on music in Edmonton in 1920, and did his poster board, which was part of the competition of poster boards with lots of things about the Halifax Harbor explosion and the Frank Slide and various other Canadian history things. And here's this weird one on history of music in Edmonton in 1920, which did not win, as it should have, I will say. But
Re-enter.
yeah. So I stole that project from my son, and remembering Regula's observation, started to look at music in early Edmonton, and it seems strange to say now. It took me a while to realize that the concept of settler colonialism was the only thing that could help make sense of what was going on here. And what astonishes me is that nobody had said that before. Settler colonialism was not really a part of the music historical discourse in North America.
Which is astonishing.
Yeah. And I stumbled towards it, honestly. But it also gave me a chance to, it was a departure and it wasn't, in that I kind of think of myself as a person whose limits are the long 19th century, right? You start sometime in the late 1700s and end sometime in the early 20th century. So I could still be historical and not have to worry about creepy things like interviewing other human beings, so I could still go to the library and smell old books and, feel good
Old
about
journals.
Yeah, exactly.
Good pictures.
Yeah, lots of old pictures, go to the archives, find stuff. But it was also a project that could easily engage, or could effectively engage, students just because the materials are here rather than in Europe, which logistically is a heck of a lot easier. And you don't have to learn, well, you should learn other languages for anything, but that's another plug. In fact, that's probably a weakness of some of that Edmonton stuff, is that I should know several other languages to adequately deal with the history of music in early Edmonton. But anyway, it's accessible to students for research projects that can, original research becomes much more possible when it's 5 miles away.
Yeah, and I was in the class. It was such a pleasure to see you lecture a class. Come back, David Gramit at the U of A, teaching music, lecturing music in Canada's course that Patrick is teaching. But I was there, and I was seeing you talking about these maps of early Edmonton, and because this is the city that I live in, I could connect in a way that, and I could see students having similar, nodding reaction about yes, the University of Alberta, where the forest was, or
yes.
And the story of the land, and sort of I think it connects.
I am somewhat embarrassed to have to admit, but also surprised that it took me this long to think that I should begin courses on music history by acknowledging that this building in particular is on Laurent Garneau's farm. We are teaching music where the preeminent fiddler of early Edmonton lived, and this person who was arrested during the Riel Rebellion and forbidden from seeking political offices because of his background, and here we are with this music department. It's just, it brings it home.
On the same line that he was fiddling. it's almost time to open the questions to the floor. So start thinking about your questions that you want to ask David. But David, before kind of like we open to the floor, anything else you want to tell us about your Edmonton? Do you work on Edmonton? Things that really surprised you, or that kind of like that you want to invite people to do more?
Well, that's the first thing that occurred as I started that question. Is the first thing to say about that is do more of it. It's really interesting stuff, and encourage other voices into it. I am a American-born settler scholar trained in European traditions who started looking at music in early Edmonton. There are a lot of other voices to be heard about that. And there's a lot of stuff out there in different methodologies, different, I'm not so good at wanting to talk to live people, but there are people who are good at that. Do it.
You were so evocative, I think, in what you said at the Patrick lecture, that in terms of the methods, there are some histories of early musical Edmonton that have been written, but that's very much to do with power. Sometimes it's also more to do with things that were prohibited, liquor licenses or dance hall that were kind of like risque and needed to be closed. But there is an oral history that needs to be heard, and people that need to be asked about. And so that's some of the work is being done, but there's certainly more space for more voices.
Oh, I should also acknowledge that one of my predecessors here, Wesley Berg, was also somebody who was active in some of the first publications on the history of music in Edmonton. So that's out there too.
Yeah. Wonderful. I think this is a great moment to open questions to the floor. Questions for David about his career, about his time at the U of A, about the work that he did. Things that you're curious about. Yes.
Wonderful talk, first of all, David. I just had a question when you were mentioning sort of finding these different historical perspectives, not just looking towards, say, a composer's work or their style, or even how the music was performed, but more the public and social aspects of how that music affected. Would you say that there is more or less, or would you say a good balance of value in not just studying a composer, but also the time and the social aspects that they lived in?
I think I'm hesitating for an answer because there are some beautiful studies that are just studies of composers. This is not a. I think that looking into the context in which the composer lived is one thing which can inform your thinking about how the notes that got written down how and why those notes got written that way. But also, it's never the end of the story. That is, composer puts work out there, and notice how we slide immediately into a written tradition as our default there. Then the composer has no more control over what people do with it. And things can be reimagined. I mean, there are pieces of music that reimagine earlier compositions in very interesting ways, but just the act of listening and trying to make sense of something almost certainly does something different than the composer imagined, because you're a different person than the composer. And the further you are, the more distant you are geographically or chronologically or in background, the more likely you are to understand it very differently, and can be absolutely fascinating. And then as a third person, a scholar coming along, imagining what somebody else might have imagined, then the possibilities just
Multiple.
version, yes.
I love it, yes. Excellent. Other questions? Don't be shy. Go for it,
You
Bill.
mentioned about writing it down, and I wonder if, do you think when you write it down, you think you have something important to say, so you're gonna write it down so someone else can read it, and then it passes on from one thing to another, because we think it's more important than just telling somebody, or just singing it, or just sharing it in that way. Is there something about our self-worth that we're trying to see?
Interesting. Writing it down, yeah. There is something powerful about writing. And yes, we want to fix something as a rule. Although, there is I think the recognition has grown in the last maybe even 100 years now, that in fact you do write something down, and yes, you try to fix something, but people are going to do something different with it. If we go back to settlement, the idea of written versus oral has a lot to do with cultural difference between settler and indigeneity too. And the reason this pops into my head is one of the pictures I showed near the end of the presentation I did this afternoon of there's a marvelous photograph of a violin studio from Alberta College in around 1910. Yes, in which Professor Chisholm poses very imposingly with his mustache and gray hair, and you would not want to backtalk to that instructor. And his students are posed around him with the younger ones down at the front and the older ones in the back. And in the middle is a music stand facing outwards towards the camera with music on it. And I've actually zoomed it up. It looks like actually a book of violin etudes. It's not like Beethoven or something, but it is written music. And that is in sharp contrast to any number of pictures of fiddlers from early Edmonton who are sitting there holding their fiddles, or in the case of Laurent Carnot's portrait, it's sitting on the table next to him, but there's not a written note of music in sight. Something written down has not just the authority that I want to fix it because I think I have some good ideas, but it links it to that tradition of writtenness and civilization, if you like.
And distances it from
Yes.
these other practices.
Yes.
Probably to take the photo and put the music in was a very clear message. We're not doing fiddling.
Yes.
This is a different kind of. There was an interesting picture. Yeah, other question, Julia.
So I want to ask something about your career as a graduate advisor, because you spoke a bit about what you did not get at your university during your training. And were you at Duke? Is that where you were?
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned that you did not kind of get what most people would get now, which is the license to talk about the social, etc. What were your competencies in which you were trained at Duke, right? Mm-hmm. And how does that contrast with how you yourself trained graduate students? Were there holdovers? Were there things that you decided to not stress as much or abandon altogether?
I got to watch what I say here because some of my I was at a graduate program that had a medievalist and we didn't actually have we did have a Renaissance person as well, and a Baroque person and a 19th century person who, of course, you didn't have a 20th century person because why would you need a musicologist for that? So yes, studies of the periods of Western music history, the notation, 2 semesters of notation, medieval and Renaissance music notation, and various topical seminars. So in some ways, the structure, except for the notation courses, was not so different from a typical graduate program even now. But I think the content of the seminars and the well, maybe this summarizes it better, that there was a fixed body of music to master.
Wow.
Why else would you call it a master's degree, right? You are mastering something. And that is music from chant through whatever time you want to stop. The same professor who held up the copy of Charles Rosen's Classical Style insisted that he wrote one article about Beethoven, but that was really pushing it, because the tradition really died after Beethoven.
Oh my goodness, that was late for him?
Yeah,
oh my goodness.
Yes. But yes, there's this fixed body of stuff. Then if there is that fixed, even that's still a heck of a lot of music, right? But it's finite. You can imagine knowing it well enough that you could master it. I had a colleague, in fact, whom you knew, Gerald Hoekstra, who interviewed at Kentucky, where Gerhard Hertz, one of the German emigre musicologists, still held sway, and did his interview for the job. And then Gerhard Hertz took him into a room and said, okay, now we will find out what you know. And sat him down and basically gave him a test of whether he knew music. And of course, what music meant was medieval through probably the Baroque. I don't know if you'd go much further than that. But that's that finite body. Whereas we did open some doors, and I'm delighted that we have actually now have people in popular music and media studies, as well as ethno and traditional musicology and theory, that you can't pretend that anymore. There is too much to know. So there is more openness, I think, in that regard. And that maybe is I think, the biggest and healthiest difference.
Did you consider Alfred Fischer, the modernist that was here at all? I mean, he had a certain background in not modernism.
Yeah.
But he certainly had a forward-looking thing in his composition.
He was a fascinating guy. He left fairly early in my stay here.
10 minutes into your stay here, about.
Yeah. He would probably disagree with a lot of what I've just been saying. Of course, he liked to disagree with people in general.
Everyone.
Yes. But he was a modernist, but very much in favor of the tradition. You grew out of much like Schoenberg, I guess, that the modernism grew out of knowing the tradition and responding to it.
Any final question for David before we continue over a lovely glass of wine? Do you want to ask something? No, that's all. Do you want
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, David.
Hi.
So this is in the spirit of a musicologist is going to musicology. And I'm curious to know, with your interest in local music histories, if you have engaged, whether written or listening, to the local music histories of your current place of residence.
That's a real interesting, yes. For those, I now live on the coast, so I had to break out the parka to come here, on a Gulf island, where retired folk singers are thicker than, very interesting people, actually. I've certainly engaged listening. Have I engaged with Scott? Honestly, not much. I'm kind of curious. At the same time, I've been kind of more curious about learning how the forests work. So, I may get to that. I might not. I don't know. Meanwhile, there's some interesting music going on there, too. And there is, in fact, a tradition of brass bands and indigenous brass bands out on the West Coast as well as here. So I know there's a lot of stuff, and I'm I'm not doing it yet.
What a lovely note to end. Please join me thanking David Gramit.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for coming. It's a delight to be here.
Yeah, and wine, lovely refreshment, sandwich. Well done, David.
Thank you.
That was excellent. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Did you like it?
It was fun.